Welcome to today's session where we dive deep into the intriguing discussion on gospel authorship. So essentially, there's a rethinking of who penned those texts.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Traditionally, people thought these gospels were written by people from peasant communities carrying on oral traditions, right?
Exactly. But Walsh argues it's like, hold on, these authors were actually part of a highly educated, though not necessarily wealthy, class. They belonged to a literate elite, drawing heavily on Greco-Roman literary conventions. That completely changes our perspective, doesn't it?
For sure. It challenges our assumptions about who actually had the capability or even the motive to author such texts.
And then there's this point about the very idea of origins. Walsh critiques the notion of a singular moment of authenticity. Basically, the term origins implies one true, once-and-for-all Genesis, but that's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, she draws attention to the romantic nationalist ideas that emerged back in the 19th century, especially in German scholarly traditions like the work of the Brothers Grimm.
Right. Exactly. And she questions the concept of texts being authored collectively by a community. I mean, think about it. You never hear about a Philo community or a Josephus community. It's always an individual or a specific author crafting the narrative.
That's a really strong argument. It makes you wonder if we've been oversimplifying the complexities behind these texts for too long.
Absolutely. It's interesting how she dives into the interplay between literary culture and oral tradition. While oral tradition did exist, it seems totally insufficient to explain the intricate literary construction of the Gospels.
Indeed. So let me get this straight. She argues that these texts show clear signs of being written in styles familiar to Greco-Roman genres like biography and history.
Spot on. Take Luke's introduction, addressing Theophilus, which mirrors Greco-Roman historiographical tropes. It clearly indicates that the author had a strong literary intent, not just a passive collector of oral stories.
Interesting. That definitely makes it harder to simply label these as community texts. It rather points to a deliberate exercise in literary craftsmanship.
Now, another key point is the role of literacy in antiquity. Literacy back then was rare, like roughly 4% of the population could compose complex prose. That really frames the context.
That's a really low number. Given that Jesus' original audiences were likely illiterate, it seems these texts were intended for a very different audience, a broader, more sophisticated reading public.
Exactly. So the Gospels were composed by a class distinct from those oral traditions we assume dominated early Christian communities. It's a shift from a minimalist view of early Christian authorship.
And that ties in with her comparative analysis. She draws parallels between gospel narratives and Greco-Roman texts, like Petronius's Satyricon, does she not?
Yes, indeed. It's quite compelling how motifs like anointing before death, funerary meals, and even the motif of an empty tomb are common between them.
Interesting comparison. But, I wonder if these parallels could be coincidental. I mean, couldn't similar themes emerge independently in different cultural narratives?
That's a fair point. However, Walsh's argument suggests that these similarities are too striking to be mere coincidence. It implies that gospel authors were very much embedded in the broader literary culture of their time.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And then there's the whole issue of why the Gospels have been treated so differently. Walsh suggests that New Testament studies are held back by inherited scholarly traditions and an institutional legacy that views these texts as uniquely sacred and, community reflective.
Right. And that contrasts with how the classics have moved on to more nuanced literary analyses. It's like society's perceptions have boxed in the Gospels into a specific framework that might not capture their full complexity.
Yes, exactly. That's one of the most provocative parts of the argument. It's essentially calling for a paradigmatic shift to apply classical literary methodologies to early Christian texts.
It's a bold stance. It's like comparing apples to oranges, right? I mean, if you're analyzing a Roman novel using methods designed for analyzing communal folklore, you might miss the richness of its construction.
Precisely. And Walsh really challenges us to rethink what we assume about community authorship. It's not that God-inspired community consensus produced these texts, but that a few learned individuals with a firm grasp of, Greco-Roman literary techniques took on the role. So when we think about audience and reception, the intended audience of the Gospels may have been way broader and more diverse than simply Christian communities. They likely interacted with wider Greco-Roman literary networks.
And that, in itself, is incredibly eye-opening. It moves us away from a narrow, almost insular understanding of early Christianity and its texts.
Exactly. You see, it's like a shift from viewing these texts as sacred relics belonging solely to a small community to appreciating them as dynamic literary works that engaged with the broader, bustling intellectual life of the Roman world.
Definitely. Now, I do have a critique, though. While I appreciate her push against the traditional view, isn't there a risk of underestimating the role oral traditions might have played? I mean, even if the text is lit up with literary technique, the oral culture still forms a part of the story, don't you think?
That's a good question. Walsh does acknowledge the existence of oral traditions, but she argues that they're simply not enough to account for the deliberate literary structure we see in the texts. So while oral tradition provided some building blocks, the actual construction was carried out by literate authors using those classical modes.
I get that.
Right? And it's like the oral tradition might have been the raw material, but then you've got this refined literary process taking over, which is where the true craftsmanship shows.
And that refinement, according to Walsh, is what aligns these texts more with works of fiction or historical writing from the Greco-Roman world, rather than a simple record of communal memories.
Exactly. And it's interesting to note that this perspective also asks us to reconsider how we define historical authenticity. Instead of a singular definitive origin, we can see the Gospels as products of a complex interplay between literary artistry and cultural borrowing.
Yeah, it's a layered approach.
And that brings us full circle to the importance of looking at these texts not in isolation, but in the context of all literary production of that era. It opens up so many avenues for new research using methodologies borrowed from classical literature studies.
It really does. This approach could transform not only how scholars view early Christian texts, but also how we understand the transmission of ideas in the ancient world altogether.
Yes, and honestly, it's like opening a new chapter on literary history, where boundaries between sacred texts and secular writings blur, revealing a shared cultural heritage.
That's quite a revelation. And to think, all this while we've been operating under assumptions that might have boxed these texts into a corner. It's a great reminder of how critical re-examination of our inherited frameworks can be.
Absolutely. It challenges us to reassess what we know. It invites future researchers to bring in tools from classical studies, which might yield more nuanced insights into the world the Gospels emerged from.
I like that point. It's a call for interdisciplinary approaches. Even if one might be a bit skeptical at times about completely sidelining the oral traditions, the convergence of literary and historical methodologies is undeniably exciting.
Definitely. In the end, Walsh's argument pushes us away from the simplistic community authorship model and encourages a richer, more layered understanding of early Christian literature.
Yep, reminds us to always question the status quo. And that's the real beauty of this discussion. It not only reframes the past, but also challenges how we approach literature and history in a broader sense, inviting debate and deeper inquiry.
Well said. It's a reminder that history is dynamic and our understanding should be too. Thanks for this engaging conversation. And here's to challenging assumptions and expanding our intellectual horizons.